Many years ago, I saw a slogan which read, "If you can keep your head when all around are losing theirs, then the chances are you haven't understood the problem." Now, I would like to adapt that to, if you can keep your head when all around are losing theirs, you must have your faith in the rock that is God. I don't think that there's ever been a time in my own life when there's been a greater sense of unease, of fear, and even panic at large. Indeed, I often think that the media and the powers that be contribute to stoke this sense of widespread alarm, though it is undoubtedly there anyway, even without their best efforts. And the truth is that Christians are not immune from these tendencies. We live in the same world. But the great difference is, or at least ought to be, that we have somewhere we can go to, or rather, someone we can go to. In our ponderings in the Psalms, we have arrived at Psalm 125. It's the sixth of the 15 songs of ascents that would have been sung by the pilgrim worshippers of old as they made their way from all over Israel and even beyond, up to Jerusalem and the temple for the great feasts of the calendar. And as the writer of this psalm arrives in Jerusalem, he is struck by the setting of Mount Zion and its surrounding hills. And as he considers them, he sees in them a helpful spiritual analogy of protection and security. So I want to divide up the psalm in this way. Verse 1, it speaks of permanent stability. Verses 2 to 3, personal security. And 4 to 5, practical sanctity. So first of all, verse 1, permanent stability. And in many ways, this opening verse serves as a summary of the psalm as a whole. And it asserts the stability of God's people, that is, those who live by trust in Yahweh, the true and living God. Imagine the scene. The psalmist, probably actually standing with his feet on Mount Zion itself, is assured by the conviction that when his trust is actively anchored in God, then his faith is as stable and immovable as the very mountain on which he is standing. Now, it's important to note, this is not a boast about strong faith per se. After all, faith is only as strong as that in which it is placed. And faith that is placed in God himself is as sure and immovable as a mountain, which cannot be moved, not even by the most violent storms or tremors of earth. Then verses 2 and 3, personal security. And these two verses are a pair, because verse 3, beginning with the word for, gives the reason why verse 2 can be taken as true. You see, Jerusalem as a city was not only stable because it was built on Mount Zion, but Mount Zion itself was secure because it was surrounded by several mountains and hills, making the city almost impenetrable. And the child of God, trusting in God, has an infinitely greater security than even that. For we are protected not by a range of mountains, but personally by God himself. And, stresses the psalmist, that security is for all time. End of verse 2, from this time forth and forevermore, which is what leads to the reassuring words of verse 3. You see, you might be in Jerusalem and be very aware of many enemies that threaten it, or conscious of the fact that at any moment in time, the wicked may seem to be in the ascendancy or even in power. But, writes our psalmist, their hold on power and influence, represented by the scepter in verse 3, is temporary and is passing because they are effectively trespassing on property that does not belong to them. It's been allotted to the righteous. And there's a danger. And the danger is this at the end of verse 3, that if the state of affairs is allowed to continue, the righteous might take matters into their own hands and act in an unrighteous way. So God will protect the righteous from themselves as well as their enemies and cause the wicked to be no more. And then practical sanctity in 4 and 5. And again, these last two verses form a pair, and they depict two opposite outcomes for two groups of people. One outcome is prayed for, the other is promised. Now, particularly in verse 4, I suspect we need to avoid a mistake in interpreting the prayer, because superficially it could be misunderstood as suggesting that if we are good, then God will be good to us. A sort of works-based system whereby God rewards us. But to avoid that misunderstanding, the psalmist uses the Hebrew form of parallelism to make clear what he has in mind. So the good in verse 4, part 1, are those in part 2 who are upright in their hearts. We've already seen in verse 1 another characteristic of this group. They are those who trust in the Lord. And their trust is real and genuine, and is evidenced by the overflow of their hearts, which are seen in practical goodness here in verse 4, practical holiness, practical sanctity. Friends, the Bible is full of promises of security to those who live by faith in God. And all those promises, of course, are centered not in some provision made by God, but in the very person of God. For example, think of Proverbs 18, verse 10. The name of the Lord is a strong tower. The righteous man runs into it and is safe. Or Psalm 46, verse 1. God is our refuge and strength, a very present help in trouble. To those perhaps better known passages of Scripture, why not add at least verse 1 of this psalm, if not the whole psalm, to your armory to protect you in those uncertain and dangerous times?